Alright, today we're going to do a sort of a slideshow, if you will. Each slide has got a kind of a story behind it, and I'm going to try to tell the story. Now we'll try to get this done quick enough where we won't take up too much of your time. But I'll try to set up so you can see my whole face instead of slouching in my chair, which is something I'm prone to do when I'm doing one of these. Let's start out with this one here. We got a Chevy here. And this thing came in with a really bad leak, really bad coolant leak. And you know, most everybody that's dealt with any of these newer model vehicles have seen these kind of gaskets fail. And this is a passage where coolant flows, and it had just gone south. And the interesting thing about this was, while this was going on, one of my students managed to cross thread one of these fuel lines. That's just a beautiful thing, you know, to have somebody to cross thread something that's so annoying to replace as that. But it happens sometimes when you're teaching, you know. I also had people that would piddle around and, well, my students would encounter situations where people would have overdone it with an impact wrench, and whenever we would be trying to take the wheels off, you'd have a lug nut that would just stop turning, coming off. And the optimum thing to happen is for it to twist off, and then you can replace the lug stud without that much trouble. But in some cases, those splines will get wiped off of that stud, and it'll start spinning in there. And then the wheels flopping around loose on there, and you have to do something about that. And if it's on some of these funky aluminum wheels that are really fancy, you know, it's real easy to mess one up. And there's all kinds of ways to try to deal with that. You know, you put pressure on it with a pry bar while you're trying to bust the thing off and all that. But one way or another, it takes a lot of heavy-duty problem solving. Sometimes when you take an oxygen sensor out, one of the things I would find out, I'd be changing an oxygen sensor, just a plain old straight oxygen sensor replacement. You go to screw it out there, the threads come with it, because somebody screwed it out and put it back in without putting any anti-seize compound on it. That doesn't always cause that, but sometimes it does, and that's a drag. You know, so then you got to get your 18mm socket, and, you know, and go in there. I mean, your 18mm thread tap nut socket. All right, this one right here was an interesting little thing on the Pontiac, Montana, and I had to come to this position where I would take a Tesla out, and I love to do this kind of thing. Go to the hot, go to the terminal that leaves the relay, go into the fuel pump, and if I didn't see a light there, I would have one of my students kick the gas tank with this big old boot, or have somebody hit it with a rubber hammer or something. If the light comes on, I know that your brushes have basically worn to the point of where they're barely touching, and if they come on, if it comes on then, you know, sometimes the vehicle will start, sometimes it won't. But that's a good way to determine if you've got a bad fuel pump. In this case, that method didn't work. We basically had the fuel pump relay was clicking. You know, we actually, you know, the relay was okay. So we were checking. We just got the test light to see if there was any ground coming back through the fuel pump windings all the way, you know, because the ground's on the other side of the pump. And that doggone thing didn't have any ground showing. And I said, well, kick the gas tank. So we kicked the gas tank, the light came on. That fooled us into thinking there was a fuel pump problem. But when we pulled the gas tank off and pulled the fuel pump out, it was brand new. Somebody had already replaced it. So we got looking a little deeper. And right in front of, kind of up there close to in the wheel well over there, in that vintage, you know, for several years, GM would run a connector like this through the floorboard, and then they would plug in. And this is right there where all the salt splash is and all that stuff. I don't know, that wasn't too smart, it didn't seem to me like. Anyway, this is what we found on that particular one, is these chalked up terminals. It just so happened we created enough disturbance when we hit that tank with a hammer to where this connection was made right here. Anyway, we had to replace both those connectors and all their terminals to get that taken care of. Now this one right here was a Kia. You know, it's an email I got here. This guy said him and his wife were driving from Florida to Florida from North Carolina when their 2004 Kia Rio broke down. The timing belt broke, and the entire engine had to be replaced because it usually breaks the snaps the head off a valve, and that snapped off head beats around in there and ruins the head and the piston and everything else. So, you know, if a Kia, one of these little, you know, 1.6 6s or whatever it is. If it jumps time, it's going to destroy the engine to where you need to put one in it. They still owed $7,000 on the car. And he says, my question is, would you advise sinking another $3,000 or so into the Kia with 90,000 miles? And the problem that they had was they went beyond the change interval for the timing belt. That's not the kiss of death on every car. A lot of vehicles won't destroy the engine or won't even bend a valve if they jump time. But these little Kias will. These typically Korean-made engine with the timing belt. Also, if any vehicle's got a timing chain, it'll do that too. If something causes the timing chain to fail, it's going to kiss valves and all. Because they go ahead and let all those be interference engines. Anyway, this one here, if I'm not mistaken, I think the interval for changing the timing belt on this is 108,000, and they had gone past that, or maybe it's 100,000 and they went to 108. Anyway, you go a little bit past the interval for changing the timing belt on one of these, and you're courting disaster. This girl came in one day for another problem on her little SUV, and I could hear the timing belt slapping the plastic cover. And I told that girl, I said, why don't you let us throw a timing belt on this? At the college we didn't charge any labor anyway. I said, why don't you let's put a timing belt on this so you don't have an issue where it jumps time and bends the valves and all that. And I don't remember what kind of SUV it was. It might have been anyway, I'm not going to fret about that. But I knew that was one of the ones that would bend the valves. And she said, sure, no problem. So I ordered a $40 timing belt. She never came back. And about 6 weeks later, or a couple of months, she came and said, the Thursday after I was supposed to bring it back to you, the timing belt jumped and it bent all the valves, and I had to pay $1,500 to have the head reworked and all that. Well, some people you just can't tell them anything, so one way or another, I was just trying to help her out. This right here was something that used to happen on the late 80s Fords. This ignition switch would come apart, and it would happen on Mustangs and pickup trucks. They had a recall on the late 80s F-150s, then where we were supposed to replace. I think there were 8 million of those trucks recalled, and I think we did 7 million of them at the place where I was working. And because I got where I could change an ignition switch by just reaching under the dash and feeling around and do it in, minute and a half, 2 minutes or something, because it was something that if you understood how it works, you could do. But anyway, one time, the reason they did it was the ignition switch, when it got loose like this, sometimes would spark and catch fire. And we actually had one. The front end guy had a F-150 that was an 89 model or something up on the lift. It was nearly new, and this ignition switch caught fire, and it burned through the dash and cracked the windshield and all that, and just messed that truck up bad. But it wasn't the front end man's fault. It just so happened that it took place while he had it on the lift whenever it was up in the air. I still remember looking up there and seeing all those flames inside the truck. It's really spooky when you see something like that. But anyway, anytime you see an ignition switch coming apart like that, it's best not to try to fix it. They don't cost much. They're not that hard to change. Just put one on there, but be careful, because some of your parts house ignition switches, there's a ground wire that goes to some of these ignition switches that's supposed to prove out the some of the warning lights when you turn it to start position. And I have seen it where inside the ignition switch shorted out and burned up that little ground wire. Because it was an ignition switch that came from the parts store. I'm not trashing all the parts store ignition switches, but just be very careful. Sometimes it's best to buy OEM. And you'd be surprised too how often you might go to the OEM and find out that it's actually cheaper or almost exactly the same price as the parts store brand. I've seen that on multiple occasions. Plastic parts carrying coolant has never been, in my opinion, my humble opinion, has never been a good idea. I don't know. And any of you guys that has done a lot of work have probably seen plastic parts fail. The radiators are plastic now, and a lot of the fittings that carry the coolant are plastic. And how many plastic fittings have split or failed and dumped a whole bunch of coolant out? And it's, it could be, it's almost like planned obsolescence. They feel like if you burn the engine up, maybe you'll want to buy a new car. But this one was a plastic part that broke. There's what's left of the threads in there. And that was, hot coolant going through plastics is really a bad idea. It's kind of like having a plastic oil pan, really. Let a rock hit one of those on a cold morning. Anyway, that's what it looked like when we got it all out of there. That was the busted part. And this was a metal part. Now this was a Chinese-made metal part that came from a part store. And I did appreciate the fact, I don't care if that was Chinese or not, because it was going to be better than that stupid plastic one, no matter which way you cut. Another, some of you might have seen on these Oldsmobile, these little plastic elbows that go where on the 3.8 Oldsmobiles and stuff, where the coolant goes through the tensioner, which is about the stupidest thing I've ever seen anybody do. And those little plastic elbows like to fail, and the parts store came out with some aluminum ones, and sometimes the dealer will come out with improved ones like that. Okay, now what's wrong with this picture? Whenever we've been doing the work as long as some of us have, one of the things I never understood, I would watch students that I was just getting started teaching. I would say, you have these open-ended lug nuts like you see on this one here, and I would say, pull this wheel off and let's put it back on, And I told them, you got to start the lug nuts with your finger. You don't zip them on there with an impact wrench. I'm talking about you can tighten them with an impact wrench on the lowest setting, then you're going to follow up with a torque wrench and run it up to the spec. That's the way I always taught that. Or you can use one of the little, torque sticks and all that if you're happy with that. But the long and the short of it is, I watched them pull the wheel off and then immediately put the lug nuts back on there backwards, just like that. And I don't remember a time in my life, even when I was a little bitty boy, when I didn't know how lug nuts went on. I was paying attention to that when I saw my dad changing tires, and I knew that bevel side went to the inside. But some people, I don't know, it's strange how that some people make an error like that. Right after they pull the wheel off, they put it back on with the lugs on backwards. Figure that out for me. These Chevrolet sending units in the, about around the 2000 vintage and past that a few years and all that, they actually had this kind of sending unit, and you can see how these little fingers wear out and they get to where they won't drag on there. The new one has got a little bit different design to it where they're less prone to wear out. This is the one you can buy from the Chevrolet dealer. You can buy just the gauge part of it. Now you can't get that from the parts store unless something has changed since the last time I tried. But I don't know how many of these things we've done. Something else that we have is the instrument clusters in those trucks. When the gauges go wacky, and most of you guys probably know, you can actually go on Amazon and buy a full set of those little stepper motors and all the tools you need to change them. And you can change out those little stepper motors for them gauges on the back of them Chevrolet clusters. Not very hard to do if you're any hand with a soldering iron. Some of the kits come with a soldering iron, a thing to pull, and some solder, all of the lights, all of the little servo motors, little white motors, and all that. And that's really kind of an enjoyable project. I always kind of enjoy doing those. But a lot of the times you'll see these gauges fail this way and all that. This is when it's a good idea to know how to get your amp function on your meter and hook it up so that you're letting the amps go through your meter all the way to the fuel pump. Pull the fuel pump relay, go from power to the one going out to the fuel pump, and see how many amps that fuel pump pulls. If it's only pulling 1.5 amps, you're out of gas. And this is the time when you can do that. Actually, on these Chevrolet pickups, there's a little pin that says prime next to the fuel pump relay, and you can actually, without even pulling the fuel pump relay, you can go have your amp meter set on amp, have to read amps, and your amp meter becomes a jumper wire whenever you got it hooked up like that. And then you hook from the positive battery terminal to that prime port, and it actually is going straight to the pump. And you can read how many amps the pump is pulling and get an idea what's going on. You can also do a scope, trace of the, if you make a multiplier by wrapping wire around and hook your inductive probe around and go to your scope, you can get a really nice fuel pump commutator trace, which is handy as a shirt pocket. Now, I've talked about this one time before. You get a breaker like that one. It's an 8 amp breaker, and you hook a bulb up in parallel with that, and then you run that in series with your shorted circuit. The cool thing that a lot of people that I've heard them talking about one time down in Louisiana when I was at a Chrysler school is you can take find you an old TV remote. It's got really poor shielding. All right, tune the AM radio to the lowest end of the AM band, and then with the key on and the radio playing, we'll go out here to your antenna and mash the button, one of the buttons on that TV remote, and it'll make a lot of static. If it's anything that'll make static, on that antenna is what you're after, you know, and you want to see what kind of distance you're looking at. Okay, so then you can pull your fuse out that's blowing and determine which side of it is feeding the circuit that's being, you know, that's going to the load. And you can connect a jumper wire between the antenna on the vehicle and the side of that fuse is going to the loaded part of the circuit where the short is. And with your radio on and your key switched on, you can take that TV remote and follow the harness, mashing the buttons on that remote. And when you get to the place where the ground is, you'll hear a lot of static on your radio. I mean, I don't know how many of you have heard of that before, but that was something they were talking about at the at a Chrysler school I went to one time. I thought it pretty neat, and it does work. But you got to have a remote that will create that disturbance, you know, and all of them obviously won't. But anyway, you can actually when you put this breaker in there, and this breaker opens and closes as the short is, you know, when the short's there, this light will be on when the breaker's open, and it'll be off when it's closed. And while you're listening, or you can put a buzzer on there, when you're listening, you can be unplugging stuff to find the short. Like, for example, on this one here, and this was the truck, the same truck that we had that gasket problem on. It was throwing a mass airflow sensor code. And so the mass airflow sensor code, when I got to looking, this fuse turned out was blown. That was causing it to throw a mass airflow sensor code. Okay, and so what happens is when you turn on the key, this is powered up, this is powered up, and that's powered up. But it also goes other places. Doesn't just go there. You gotta make sure that you go where you're at. It also, that same fuse, you know, feeds all of this stuff. And so when we went unplugging oxygen sensor, because the heater is fed with that, and then you know, anyway, the long and the short of it, that old truck there, the engine controller wasn't controlling the heater was just directly coming from power. And you notice it was hardwired to ground. And so when we unplugged this oxygen sensor here, that breaker quit tripping, and it turned out we had a shorted oxygen sensor heater that was causing a mass airflow sensor code, because the mass airflow sensor had no power going to it because the oxygen sensor kept blowing the fuse. And so it took an oxygen sensor to fix a mass airflow code on that one. All right. Okay, we disconnected that particular one, and then that's when we wound up doing that. I actually prepared that slide for that. On this CSFI, you know, sequential, you know, central sequential fuel injection, like General Motors have with the Spider fuel injection. I always like to put those electronic injectors under there because it's just a whole lot better system that way. But anyway, I have seen this hose right here drip water on the distributor and cause problems because it sweats. That's the suction pipe for your air conditioner, and it sweats, and when there's a lot of humidity, you know, you may have an issue with that if it drips just exactly right. Now, I don't have the picture of the one I want to talk about now. This girl came in one time with a radio noise in her little S10 Blazer, and it was just buzzing up a storm over the radio when you give it the gas. And so I said, well, the first thing we need to do is we're going to unplug the alternator to see if that makes the buzzing noise go away. So we did. Buzzing noise was still there. But when I unplugged the ignition coil, the instant I unplugged the ignition coil, or I mean the module on that one, I think it was easy to get to. One way or another, I killed the ignition system, whatever I did. I've slept since then. But I unplugged it, and the moment I unplugged that buzzing went away, and I knew it was in the ignition system. Anytime you've got a naked spark, it's going to make radio frequency interference. You're going to hear it through your radio. You wouldn't hear it on the tape player. You'd only hear it through the radio. And the farther toward the bottom, the lower end of the AM band, the louder it gets, but it can show up anywhere in there. We pulled the distributor cap off, and this little thing here had fell out of there and was rolling around down in here, and so every time a spark came out of the coil, it had to jump before it could hit that, and that was a naked spark that was causing radio frequency interference, so she was hearing through her radio. So she basically just needed a distributor cap on that one, is all she actually had to have. Of course, we usually replace them both when we're doing that. Now, your camera retard offset adjustment on this CSFI is really important, and I had people forevermore. That CSFI that's got the spider that's up under the plastic intake, you know, like in the late 90s Chevys pickups. And what they would do is they'd say I had to have intake gaskets put on my whatever it is, that's got a V8 Chevy CSFI engine. And afterward, we wind up with a horrible fuel economy. And it wasn't like that before. And I said, okay, so what you do is you go in there with your scan tool. You got to have a scan tool that will read this. And you go to the cam retard offset, and it's usually supposed to be set on 0. You can look it up. Although I will tell you, in some of the shop manual literature, it's doggone hard to find. But usually 0 is the good setting. Some of them, there's one I think that's a screwball setting. But anyway, what you got to do is, with the engine above 1,000 RPM and looking at your scan tool, you got to turn that distributor till that thing reads 0 and lock it down. Because if it's reading too far out, it bank fires the injectors and your fuel economy goes to crap. And a lot of the people that they felt like, if you put a distributor back in there and it's running, since you can't set the timing on this one because it's got a crank sensor, the cam sensor is all that's in the distributor, but it's got to be indexed right, or that thing will bank fire the injectors and get horrible fuel economy. And that's a fairly simple thing there. Up into the real early 2000s, some of the V6s still had that system on them, by the way. So I was kind of glad when they did away with it. That thing runs really, really good when it's running like it should. But the crazy thing about it is those poppets under there, they have to have like 61 pounds of fuel pressure to even start, because those poppets won't pop if they don't have a certain amount of fuel pressure. And the little solenoid units are up in the top where it goes through. Those are really aggravating to troubleshoot if you're not used to them, because you can't really get to the injectors. But I have seen them where they have 55 pounds of fuel pressure, but they wouldn't start because they needed like 61. And that's a sliding scale, because it's not exactly the same on every one of those trucks. It's just wacky. Now this one right here is an interesting story. When I was at the college, this guy gave me an '89 Bronco. He didn't give it to me, he gave it to the college, donated it to the college for a tax write-off and all. And he said that he felt like it had a blown head gasket, and he didn't want to fool with spending the money on it. And so he just donated it to the college. And I noticed when we crank it up, it ran, not terrible, but just didn't quite run right. And the longer you ran it, the more it would start, punching coolant out the radiator. Out of the, fill neck on the radiator. And it did this, I said, well, we're not going to be driving it up and down the road anyway. We're just going to move it around the yard, and we're going to do stuff on it in the shop. Well, it turned out one day I had one of the guys pulling the spark plugs out, because we had cranked it cold enough where we'd foul the plug, just moving it around. And I said, this is like pulling the plugs out of your truck, isn't it? He goes, no, that's the 5.8. Mine's a 5 liter. I said, wait a minute. This is a 5.8. And I noticed this guy had this 1542637 firing order numbered on the cap. He had wired this thing up like a 302, and it was a 5.8, which is 137265548. And the reason the thing was running so bad was acting like punching coolant out and all, was because the knothead had put the spark plug wires on in a 302 firing order and in a 5.8. So when I put another distributor cap on it, and I put we put the firing order right, and that thing ran like a sewing machine. And so his own lack of knowledge about the firing order was what caused him to wire that thing up wrong, and then think it had a blown head gasket because of how it was acting, and he gave it to the college. I don't know if you could duplicate that by just trying it on another one or not, but that's what happened on that one, because I was there. This is not hearsay. This is what happens when you spill toner on your desk. This toner cartridge was defective some kind of way, and I'm holding it in my hand, and also, poof, I got black toner all over my desk. You know what the good news is? That's dry powder, and you can vacuum it off of there with a vacuum cleaner. So that's not as big of a catastrophe as it looks like. But I did take a picture of it, and I like to include it in a presentation every now and then just for fun. This right here was on a police car with a 4R70W transmission in it, and it kept throwing codes. And they fought with it, trying to figure out why it was throwing transmission solenoid codes. And it turned out that this connector right here had developed some oxidation, and it had an open circuit. And all that really needed to be done to fix that 4R70W where it wouldn't throw that solenoid code was to replace this connector that goes into the transmission. This is out here. This goes into the transmission and hooks up to the harness inside there. This right here is a 3.1 liter GM intake gasket failure. I don't know how many of those you've seen, but we have actually got those from shops that were telling the people they needed an engine when all they needed was an intake gasket, because these intake gaskets love to fail and they love to get a bunch of coolant in the oil. And typically, if you replace an intake gasket, and the best way to do that is say, look, don't know if there's been any damage because of all this water going in there with the oil, but what we're going to do is go ahead, we're going to change out the intake gasket. Let's give it a try. You got really nothing to lose. Swap out the intake gasket. And typically, you don't have any more trouble with them. You got to, do what you can to get that peanut butter out of there. But the long and the short of it is the PCV system will eventually steam all that stuff out, and then you'll still be okay. When you're pulling these off, though, you basically, the push rods on these 3.1s, every other one is a half-inch shorter, so you got to make sure you keep the push rods in order on those. This one right here was a fan that quit working on an Oldsmobile Silhouette. It was like a 90 model, I think it was. And that doggone thing burned that relay up. It starts getting a little oxidation. It starts to get hot. As it gets hot, the current that's flowing through it has a tendency to make it, lose its. It gets hotter and it melts more, and it finally gets where current stops flowing entirely, and the connector is destroyed, and so is the relay. That's what we fixed on that. Now this little thing right here is an idle speed control motor, only on 84 to 87 central fuel injection units on a Ford. General Motors had something similar to it. I'll mention that in just a minute. And it wasn't made as quite. This was made by Carter, which made the carburetors. I thought it was interesting that Carter built this. But right here, if you put your finger on that, you'll feel that you're operating a little switch. That is the idle tracking switch, and what that idle tracking switch does, it tells the computer whether it needs to operate the idle. When you give it the gas, this thing will actually run out for dash pot mode, and when the throttle comes back, it'll come down slowly. But it also controls idle based on correction for engine load and that kind of thing. So, but what I used to find on these was I would take a meter and hook it up to the two terminals that's going to the switch right here. And whenever your finger is off of that switch, it's supposed to be closed. When you put your finger on the switch, it opens. The GM idle speed control is the opposite of that. Whenever you put your finger on it, it's closed. When you let your finger off, it's open. But if you're measuring those, the 4 wires is you got 2 for the switch and 2 for the motor and all that. And I even built a little box out with LEDs and buttons to where I could check those. But the best way to check that switch, it's supposed to be a dead short, perfect continuity, but if you hook your meter on it and it's got 30 or 40 ohms, a lot of the times the computer will do crazy stuff with the idle. Sometimes it'll even stumble taking off because of that doggone thing. There's algorithms in that computer that it doesn't talk about very much, but a bunch of those, they're about $140 is what they cost back in the day. And so this guy came to me one time with a problem that I knew was being caused by that. When I measured that, I said, this is what your problem is. And he says, well, can't we look somewhere else for a problem? I don't have to spend $140 on that. Well, if you find the problem, looking somewhere else for the problem is not going to do. All right, this right here is a victim of a stuck throttle. I told Casey, I says, Casey, bring this trainer car Sable up to 1500 RPM and let's watch the oxygen sensors. Somehow he went all the way to the floor of the throttle, stuck under the floor mat on that old car, and it threw 2 rods out right there in the service bay. And this Desert Storm veteran I had named Frank, they had PTSD, just about jumped over the workbench when that thing blew up. We got another motor, built it up and put in that car. But the computer command control on GM cars was a really interesting thing. I went to school in 1981 in Houston for a couple of days, and you had this mixture control solenoid that would go up and down 10 times a second. When it was down, it was lean, when it was up, it was rich, and it was always dithering all the time. And you measured it with a doggone dwell meter, like you used on points, and it ought to go 25 to 35, bouncing back and forth. And whenever you had to make all your adjustments to make sure that it was floating in that range, so the oxygen sensor would be able to control it. All right, sometimes the harness chafes on the AC suction line on some of these trucks where it's real crowded in there. It'll cause all kinds of electrical problems. There's no set symptom that you'll always have on that, so just be prepared for that. All right, you can find your companion cylinders by pretending you have a vehicle with a distributor if you know the firing order. Now I always like to memorize all my firing orders. The only time I got crossed up on that was, I knew the fired order of a Dodge or a Chevrolet was, 1843657 and I figured, hey, I got this down pat, I can do that. One time when I was about 15 or 16 years old, I worked some construction work one summer, and my dad says, take my pickup truck when you're with Oscar today, and when you come back, have him swing you by the parts house and get some spark plug wires for me to put on there. And I said, okay. Well, Oscar's one of these people that grew up knowing me all my life, and whenever you grow up knowing a kid all his life, you're thinking that he can't know anything that you don't know because he's just younger than you are, and when young means stupid, right? And so I opened the hood on my dad's pickup after me and Oscar got back to the house, and I took note of where number 1 was on the distributor cap, and I just jerked all the wires off and threw them in the yard. And Oscar says, man, this truck ain't never going to start. You can't just put those wires on there any kind of way. And I said, well, I just figured I could probably put them on there where they'll look good. And to him, it looked like I was putting them over there at random, but I knew the firing order, I knew which way the distributor turned, I knew where number 1 was. That's all you need to know. And so, and you got to make sure the wires are the right length so that they're, you don't have them too long, too short, lay it on the manifold and all that. And after I popped them spark plug wires all on there, just talking about how I was just going to make it look pretty, he knew he had been had whenever I fired that truck up. It was really kind of funny to watch that happen. But the long and the short of it is, if you want to know where your companion cylinders are on a V engine, you can basically count off, or you can actually draw yourself a bogus distributor, like this right here. So these 2 are companions, these 2 are companions, these 2 are companions, and those 2 are companions. See, if it's a V8 or if it's a V6 or whatever it is, if it's of course it ain't too hard on a straight 6 to figure out what the companions are, because it's going to be the cylinders, the one in the front and the back, and then those 2, and then those 2 in the middle. Or on a 4-cylinder, it's one's on the end and one's in the middle. But on these V engines, sometimes it's tricky to figure out what your companions are if they're not marked or if you don't know. Or if it's, even if it's a coil-on plug, sometimes it's wise to be able to know what the companion cylinder is. So anyway, it's just a little trick that I came up with and taught my students a long time ago. AC repair outlets need an identifier. This one right here is a perfect example of that. 26% R30, R134, 73.4% R12. I'm not getting paid to tell you this, but Neutronics is the place to go for a refrigerant identifier. It's not cheap, but imagine if this air conditioner seemed to be working okay. What if I pulled all this out with my recycler and I put it in another, because vent refrigerant to the atmosphere, you don't do that. That's illegal. So if I pull this stuff into my recycler, now I've contaminated my recycler with trash gas. And then I'm putting it in everybody else's vehicle. And everybody knows that's trash gas. And that's why one guy on one of my videos says, I don't even know why we need to fool with an identifier. That's ridiculous, if it's a newer car. But you don't ever know. There was an '06 model Jeep Commander we worked on not before I left the college. And it had hydrocarbon refrigerants in it. And we would never have known that if we hadn't used our identifier to find out what was in that thing. Also, you need to get ESCO certified if you're going to be working on air conditioners. Just having the guy in the next service bay or the service manager ESCO certified is not good enough. Uncle Sam's guys come walking in there and they see you working on an air conditioner and you can't show them your ESCO certification. It's a $33,000 fine. So just make doggone sure before you do this you're ESCO certified. That's the end of that slideshow. I did have to run this one past 30 minutes, so I'm going to have to splice both of them together so you can actually get get the whole show. So this one here is going to be about 35 minutes long by the time the thing's over with. And I could tell a lot more stories, but right now I'm going to save some of those for later, and I hope you got something out of these little, mostly wordless slideshow.